Neon Genesis Evangelion is a show and a movie and 4 other movies, but we're not talking about those. This is a video about the whole work that is the original show and the End of Evangelion movie. If you're watching this video and you haven't seen Evangelion, then what? If you haven't, I think you should do that as soon as possible. Just watch the original show, all 26 episodes, and then the End of Evangelion movie. The rebuilds are a whole separate can of worms that's separate from both the original series and what this video is. This video will simply be a quick expression of why I think the series works so well, because it's not like you can ever exactly relay precisely why something is so fucking good, or at least why it was you think it's as good as it is, in like a deeper sense than just, oh, it's well made. Which it is, by the way, that's part of this video. Well, anyways, I recently rewatched the entire series and the End of Evangelion in its entirety for the first time since I first watched it back in 2019. I had seen End of Evangelion a few more times since then, but this is the first time going in from start to finish, and I really just want to talk about the series in broad terms and mainly focusing on the events within the TV show, because it's incredibly hard to talk about the End of Evangelion without getting super deep into specifics, and you should really be as blind as possible for that thing if you haven't seen it. You know, it's a bit of an experience. I genuinely don't know how to structure this video, or at least I didn't when I was writing this, which is what I'm reading from, so why not just start with the creator of the series, Hideaki Anno. Anno is my favorite filmmaker, just full stop. He might be my favorite artist to ever live, period. Evangelion is his definitive work, so hopefully by talking about this series, you'll understand why I think he's as good as he is. But funnily enough, Evangelion was not even my introduction to Anno. In fact, I only ever gave Evangelion a chance because I had heard it was made by the same guy who made this other film I was really into, Shin Godzilla. 2 Japanese Godzilla movies have been released in my lifetime. The first one was Final Wars back in 2004, which I missed on account of being in America at the time and also being 9 months old. But by God, I was there for Shin Godzilla. Except I didn't get to see it during its theatrical run, but I got the Blu-ray on release day. I loved Shin Godzilla on the first viewing, and its resonance only grows stronger with rewatches in time. It's seriously one of the best films from the last decade. So I only ever touched Evangelion because I was told it was done by the guy who did Shin Godzilla. And also it happened to be coming to Netflix at the time. And you know, I knew him as exactly that. This was the point where I was just really starting to get into filmmaking, like beyond a surface level. So I didn't know what a Hideaki Anno was. I just knew guy who made Shin Godzilla. And of course, like most people who fall into the show, I quickly absorbed all the information relating to Anno and the circumstances of the show's creation. It's cliche to explain it in an Evangelion video, but to put it as brief and blunt as possible, during the time before and during Evangelion's creation, Anno was going through a prolonged and nasty bout of depression. Being nearly broke and approaching a career and mental breaking point, Hideaki Anno collected everything he was, knew, and felt and created Neon Genesis Evangelion, a show that effectively represented a will to live. Though the statement of intent for the show that was written by Anno shortly before the first episode aired is referenced in pretty much every single video about Evangelion, I'm still gonna bring it up here because I think it's endlessly essential. Anno starts by describing the near-apocalyptic, decayed state of the world, and then goes on to say, "This is roughly the worldview for Neon Genesis Evangelion. This is a worldview drenched in a vision of pessimism, a worldview where the story starts only after any traces of optimism have been removed." His descriptions of Shinji Ikari and Misato Katsuragi paint a picture of deeply fragile and troubled people. Shinji as a cowardly young man who feels that his father has abandoned him, and so he has convinced himself that he is a completely unnecessary person, so much so that he cannot even commit suicide. And Misato as a 29-year-old woman who lives life so lightly as to barely allow the possibility of human touch. She protects herself by having surface-level relationships and running away. Characters, especially in anything action-oriented, are expected to have a certain level of... Characters...
Congratulations!
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 On a mainstream level, characters, especially in anything action-oriented, are expected to be endearing, to have a certain level of competence. It needs to be easy to root for them even if they aren't necessarily the good guy in the story. It's incredibly common to see viewers, especially when it comes to franchise stuff, get frustrated and annoyed by notably fragile and unreliable characters. Insecurity and flaws are allowed so long as it's dealt with in a clear character development arc. I say this because in this series, the way character development handled is very subtle and nuanced. There's not any big development breakthrough moments. And even when there seems to be, it's never exactly what it seems in terms of what the character is doing. It's a very rewarding show to go back and reinterpret moments that you thought were straightforward, but no, nothing's ever straightforward. Neatly putting characters in arcs and boxes is not something that this show is concerned with. Not that there's anything wrong with more traditional character development or that this show is completely devoid of it, but I think the way the show handles it is just so nuanced and different. The way the show writes its characters just gives you so much to unpack. As Anno goes on to state in his letter, both are extremely afraid of being hurt. Both are unsuitable, lacking the positive attitude for what people call heroes of an adventure. But, in any case, they are the heroes of this story. And that's one of the things I think is so compelling about this show. It's an exaggeration to say that the characters are entirely unlikable and they don't have any endearing qualities, at least for the events of the show. This story is not about regular people rising to the occasion. It's not a story about regular people getting swept up in extreme circumstance. Nor is it even a story about triumph through adversity in a typically direct sense. It is simply life as felt by someone. It is a production where my only thought was to burn my feelings into film. I want to briefly discuss plot and world building here. The plot structure for most episodes revolves around mysterious creatures called angels attacking Earth, and our heroes must pilot and command the Evangelions to stop them. This is where the story starts. What I find so interesting is how this is built out as the show goes on, and how the show handles world building and plot development. The world that the characters inhabit is remarkably off-putting. A world where 15 years before, over half the human population perished. A world that has been miraculously revived. Its economy, the production, circulation, consumption of material goods, so that even shelves of convenience stores are filled. A world where people have gotten used to the resurrection, yet still feel the end of the world is destined to come. A world where the number of children, the future leaders of the world, is few. There is a shroud of decay and emptiness around the whole world. Other countries are mentioned and even play minor roles sometimes, but it feels ever intangible. Tokyo 3, the place where most of the show takes place, feels like the center of the world, floating entirely alone and fighting to remain, and all too used to destruction. In the opening moments of the pilot episode, we see tanks lining a road pointing out to sea, and under the water an angel approaching, swimming through the sunken ruins of buildings. Literally within the first minutes of the show, it communicates that this is a world always prepared to fight its final battle. The plot, the overarching story, is a little buried and not always clear, which seems to be a point of disconnect for some. I personally think that is very much what the show is going for. The overarching plot mostly happens in the background and is often alluded to but sparingly explored. It explores it to the extent that it's relevant to the characters. You learn about them, and by cause and effect, the plot and lore expand even deeper into unknowingness for the viewer. The more is said, the more unsure and uneasy things become. As the show goes deeper into the darkest places of these characters, the world feels emptier and the plot more abstract. To me, that progression creates a mood that is almost indescribably real. There is a plot and it does build to something, but it may never culminate in the way you might expect. If you're looking for a tightly crafted narrative experience, a Breaking Bad style roller coaster of setups and payoffs, then you ought to look elsewhere. If you're looking for an enveloping mood, an atmosphere of perpetual anxiety, mortal dread, and heart-splitting character exploration, then by God, guy who made Shin Godzilla has you covered. I think that's my second by God this video. Hideaki Anno's directing is bonkers, sort of. Though obviously it was a team effort and lots of other people put a lot into this show, it's really Anno's directing and writing style that defines the whole thing. In any given episode, the way things start and build and pay off is just so interesting to me. An episode will typically start by introducing a thematic concept or an observation of human behavior, often ones that builds off of what we've seen from the characters previously. And it'll establish mood, it'll draw you into the atmosphere, the situation, and the daily going-ons of these characters. And then when the angel attacks, the episode will swerve into action. You'll get this fast layering of exciting animation and music, or an eerie and dreadful one depending on the episode. And the way the angel must be dealt with will usually reflect or drive deeper into the concept established earlier in the episode. Though this may sound formulaic, the show is constantly doing something new with it. And as the show goes on, it'll take that formula and take it so far conceptually that it barely resembles a formula at all. Specifically, as the angel's attacks become more psychological towards the second half of the show. It's hard to describe the rhythm and pacing of how Anno's scenes are written and edited. By its nature, the show has to be very expositional at times. Like in an action scene, for example, the parameters for the fight and the angel's capabilities have to be laid out each time. I have a semi-low tolerance for exposition, and I think that mainly comes from the fact that 95% of shows and movies deliver it in super inefficient and uninteresting ways. In Evangelion, I love every single second of exposition, especially in action scenes, because it all unfolds so sharply. The editing is disorienting to a point, yet still sharp and rhythmic in a way that channels and exemplifies what the story is trying to convey. The exposition is clear and flows naturally with the editing and the escalating drama and action of the situation. And in quieter, non-action scenes, similar principles apply. The use of ambient sounds and static shots of the given environment paint such a vivid picture. This, mixed with Anno's signature editing style, it creates something that's so deeply expressive. As usual, talking about the editing or the dramatic flow of a given scene or episode is hard to do because it's supposed to be felt and experienced. I feel like trying to put it into words is not only sometimes impossible, but it does it a disservice. But I just find the way Anno chooses and sequences his shots and the pace in which they are cut together is just so incredible. I cannot name another filmmaker who captures emotion so vividly through simple compositions and edits. And just in case you think I'm allocating too much credit to Anno's directing, I would like to point to his live-action work. Specifically his films Love and Pop and Ritual, which carry all of what I've just talked about here while also being live-action and made with a much smaller team, which is kind of crazy, but... Okay, but seriously, those two movies can be hard to find, but they are so good. It's kind of crazy how well his stylistic tendencies translated from animation to live action. Anyways, back on topic, though Evangelion is typically noted for its character development and thematic stuff, I think the way the plot develops is still really interesting. I think pretty much all 26 episodes are impeccably crafted stories. The pilot episode is my favorite pilot episode in TV history. It is so well put together. The way the tone, ambience, and character establishment rolls out with impressive action and escalation is so fucking good. In fact, the way the whole first 4 episodes of the show play out, the way they're structured to create mystery and intrigue for the viewer, and yet probe so deeply into Shinji's frail heart just within those episodes, the way the show plays with its narrative structure to do all of this is so interesting, and that's made even better when Rei and all of the existential craziness relating to her comes into play in episodes 5 and 6. It's an incredible opening arc for a television show. Though I personally find the way that the story is communicated to be really interesting, I understand that people might not be into it, but on an individual episode level, the way things are structured and paced, moment to moment, is unmatched. Hell, no spoilers, but episode 19 might be the most perfectly crafted episode of TV ever made. The way it's plotted and paced and the way it all comes together and the implications it has for the story and the lore, it's so insanely good. It's fun. And I think this show's grasp of the mechanical aspects of storytelling is severely underappreciated. And of course, before I move on, I have to mention the score. The show has such a unique and powerful soundtrack, and it's probably my favorite, right up there with the classic John Williams stuff. And when I say classic John Williams, I mean Star Wars. Now, my worry is that my descriptions of the show sound overly grim and obtuse. People love to hype up how depressing the show is and how hard it is to understand, but to say it's entirely a miserable and artsy affair is not really true. The greatest appeal of Evangelion is how unrelentingly far it goes into understanding its characters. The depths in which Anno goes in order to express himself and dig into these interconnected psyches. It gets upsetting, but Evangelion is also a show where this purple-haired woman has a pet penguin, and the penguin walks out of the bath, and it has like a towel in this fucking refrigerator or home. It lives in a refrigerator. Do you understand that? This show and all of Anno's work has a really silly side to it, and even in the broader show beyond the more overt quirky elements, there's so many small little character moments and details that add so much to the show without becoming overstated. Yes, it does go to the darkest depths possible, but it also takes its time to really let us see these characters live. It's never just one thing. I know I said the show doesn't go out of its way to endear us to these characters, but what I really mean by that is that the portrait that it's painting at any given moment is nuanced and it's constantly flowing and shifting. It doesn't start by attaching you to the happy version of this character and then send him through a depression arc. Rewatching the show really made me appreciate how consistent and subtle the characterization can be. How little behaviors early on foreshadow darker stuff that you learn about them later on. Forget the characters for a second, the action, man. Brushing aside how it furthers the character development, the action is just always so creative and exciting. The dance episode perfectly represents this side of Evangelion. Though it can be troubling in hindsight, it's such a vibrant episode of TV. It's essential for movies and TV to properly contrast emotional and tonal points. The highs and lows of the story really need to be handled with and blended with a certain level of care for the big moments to really hit hard. Getting a piece of chocolate cake halfway through a movie is one of the most beautiful things you've ever seen because the movie was so thorough in showing the prior struggles. And I will reiterate again how Evangelion takes its characters and its concepts to the furthest hills possible. And it's also real and sincere. And not just because Anno was putting his demons into his work, but because he remembered to interject the fun and life into it. There are moments of sweetness in the right places. It never fills one note. Ultimately, Evangelion might not be everyone's cup of tea. Maybe it's too slow for some, maybe the overall tone of the show is too much. And hey, that is A-okay. It truly does not matter at this point to try to poke holes in its story, to turn your nose up at the highly emotional nature of the show. And I say this because it's a show that has very clearly stood the test of time. It has continued to be relevant and to move people, and I think the world Anno projected from within himself is easily more relevant now than it was back in 1995. But to get back to my point here, there really is no amalgamation of words or criticisms that can take away from what this show was and what it achieved. I truly think this show represents everything, and I mean everything, that makes art so important and special. To work so hard to create something so rawly expressionistic. I will just roll this clip from an interview with Anno, which to me is the definitive explanation for art, period.
表現というのは基本的に欠落したものを埋めていく作業だという。それを人に伝えるための努力、自分をまともにしようとする努力。とにかくまともな手段で他人と関われない人たちがちょっとうがったことをしてなんとか自分と他人との間を保っている。それが表現というものだと思います。少なくとも僕はそうですね。アニメや映画をやることによって人と関わり続けることができる。そう思います。
壊れるっていうのは何が安野さんを壊してるんですか？
いや全部吐き出したわけじゃないですか。全身全霊かけないと面白いものにならないからですよね。自分にできることは全部やっとかないと、なるべく面白いものにしたいっていうだけだと思いますよ。
I have to briefly discuss End of Evangelion because it's essential to what Evangelion is. I've just gone over what the artist put into the work, but I need to mention a massive part of what makes what this series is doing so meaningful is its refusal to validate the viewer for becoming dependently invested in the story. It rejects the expectation to tie things up in a neat bow, to put every arc in a clean and final position, and instead points to your misplaced need for those things. And yes, when I say this, I say need, not want. We're talking about a dependent relationship between viewer and media. The meaning you're desperately seeking for the show, the reward at the end of the series, should instead be sought after in your own life and in the real world. And hell, there's nothing wrong with investment or a level of escapism with media. I mean, it just asks me to talk about those fucking movies. I'm personally not claiming to be a bada, and this is not an attempt by the series to circumvent actual substance. This is really only a piece of the larger puzzle, but it's one I want to focus on because it's an important one. The end of Evangelion is often interpreted as a big middle finger from Anno to the audience. A bait and switch on the fans who hated the show's original finale. But I find that interpretation to be so reductive and lazy. Yes, the reception to the show's ending is inseparable from End of Evangelion, but it's not inventing anything that wasn't already there in the show. Nor does it discard or overwrite the original ending. It runs parallel to it, and comes to the same conclusion, albeit in a far more aggressive and uncompromising way. It's harsh and ugly, even more than the show was, but it's ultimately incredibly positive and hopeful. In the documentary that tracks the production of the final Evangelion Rebuild movie from 2021, Anno talks about how after the reception of the show's ending, he heavily contemplated taking his own life, almost going through with it at one point.
1回は電車に飛び込もうと思ったのと、もう1回は会社の屋上から飛び降りようっていうのが2回ほど危険があって。
それ踏みとどまったのは何かあるんですか？
痛そうだから。
Which is understandable considering what that finale was, if you've seen it. But he pushed on and out of it and made End of Evangelion, just as he did when making the show in the beginning. And it's a movie that addresses the audience and re-examines what the show was about in the first place, and ultimately comes to the same conclusion. Because ultimately that will to live, that want to understand people and have that connection is what the show is about. It's why fixating on the hashtag relatable expressions of sadness and the layers of lore are putting the cart before the horse. David Lynch once said Van Gogh did suffer, but I think he didn't suffer while he was painting. He went out to paint because he loved to paint. To romanticize and mythologize depression in art is to miss the point of why it's there in the first place. It's pivotal to understand what brought Anno to make Evangelion, but to place importance on the angst and darkness when ultimately it was the love of creation and the want to change things is what made Evangelion exist. It was that hopeful desire to be better and to have a happier life. It is entirely and sincerely a story about learning to love yourself. And to refer to this letter of intent one last time, they say to live is to change. I started this production with the wish that once the production was complete, the world and the heroes would change. That was my true desire. I tried to include everything of myself in Neon Genesis Evangelion. Myself, a broken man who could do nothing for 4 years, a man who ran away for 4 years, one who was simply not dead. Then one thought, you can't run away, came to me, and I restarted this production. It is a production where my only thought was to burn my feelings into film. I know my behavior was thoughtless, troublesome, and arrogant, but I tried. I don't know what the result will be. That is because within me, the story is not yet finished. I don't know what will happen to Shinji, Masato, or Rei. I don't know where life will take them, because I don't know where life is taking the staff of the production. I feel that I am being irresponsible, but it's only natural that we should synchronize ourselves with the world within the production. I've taken on a risk. It's just an imitation, and for now I can only write this explanation, but perhaps our original lies somewhere within there. And that is more powerful than any death of the author bullshit could ever be. I hope more than anything I got across that Evangelion is so great because of the nuances of the work. It's not the neurotically plotted, impossible to understand show that a lot of people like to say it is. It's a story that I think is so densely layered in the way that it chooses to illustrate itself, in both the details and development of the plot and characters, and the stylistic mannerisms of how it handles pacing, its editing, the endlessly striking visuals, and detailed scene staging. I'm sure this video might seem heavily biased, but really, do you want me to say, oh, I love this show, but now I'm gonna spend the next 5 minutes pulling things to complain about out of my ass, just so the analysis seems fair and balanced. This is a fucking YouTube video, not a research paper. Anyways, there's a bigger picture to talk about here if I wanted to bring the rebuilds into the mix, and I would very much like to talk about those one day, and I would have to probably bring End of Evangelion back into that. It would be a very big video, and it's one I would like to make one day, but I just wanted to talk about the initial Evangelion stuff this video. I honestly think the rebuilds are like some of the most fascinating movies ever made, but yeah, whatever. Subscribe. I make short films sometimes. I sometimes make videos about making short films, apparently. And I'd like to thank you all for listening. Subscribe if you want. I might have already said that, but yeah, thank you all for making it out, and I will see you next Sunday. Road led me to your door.